I want to take you back to the year 1934. In 1934, a German scholar by the name of Walter Bauer wrote a very important book. Now, chances are in 1934 in Germany, no one was thinking much about Walter Bauer and his book. In fact, in 1934 in Germany, much more important things were happening. You may recognize that as the year that Adolf Hitler became the Führer and the leader of Germany in 1934. But behind the scenes, quietly, Walter Bauer wrote a book. That book was called Heresy and Orthodoxy in Earliest Christianity. And it proved to be one of the most famous and one of the most important books in the last 100 years. It didn't start off that way. In fact, he wrote the book and no one really noticed. In fact, about 30 or 40 years went by and no one noticed. And then suddenly the book in 1971 was translated into English, and it just like a bomb hit the American scholarly scene, and everyone started paying attention to Bauer. And here's what Bauer said in his book. What he said is that early Christianity, when you go back into its earliest phases, was full of diversity. He didn't mean ethnic diversity either. He didn't mean cultural diversity. He means that early Christianity was full of diverse theologies, diverse ideas, ideas about Jesus that were in contradiction to each other, ideas about God that were in contradiction to each other. There was competing versions of Christianity, says Bauer, that were all warring it out to see which one was original and to see which one was authentic. Bauer argued that what you have in this earliest phase is just a theological battle from all these groups, each claiming to be the original and trying to wrestle their way into power and to find out who was going to prevail as the true Christianity. What you have in this early phase, says Bauer then, is you don't have anything called Christianity. What you have is Christianities, plural. And here's the payoff, says Bauer. Each of these separate Christian groups, he argues, had their own gospels. And they had their own gospels that they thought really told the true story of Jesus. And since each of these different groups is equally valid as any other, each of these gospels is equally valid as any other, he argues. Therefore, what you read today when you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is just the gospels preferred by the people who won the theological debates. But what if another group had won, said Bauer? What if the Gnostics had won? The Gnostics were an early heresy at that particular time period. What if the Gnostics had won the debates and they prevailed as the true Christianity? Well, says Bauer, you'd be reading a very different gospel now. You'd probably be reading the gospel of Thomas, or maybe the gospel of Philip, or maybe the gospel of truth. So, says Bauer, the gospels you're reading are no different than any other gospels. If another group had won, you'd probably be reading one of those texts. What that means is all gospels are equally valid, all gospels are equally true, none have the lion's share of truth about the person of Jesus, and ultimately you can pick whatever gospel you want. Now that whole narrative, which I've just given you, started in 1934 with this book from Bauer, but here's the fact, that narrative is the predominant narrative in our scholarly world today. If you take a university religion class on the Gospels, you're going to hear that narrative. If you read the internet, you're going to hear that narrative. You may have remember years ago the book The Da Vinci Code that came out in 2006 or whatever it happens to be now, had that narrative. The narrative of our culture and our world is that all gospels are equal, none are more true than any others, and you can just pick whichever gospel and whatever Jesus happens to suit your fancy.